I'm actually giving the talk in the shoes of Julie Hawkins, who couldn't be here. The title of the talk is Medicinal Plant Use is More Strongly Influenced by Environment than Ethnicity. And today I'll be talking about transmission of traditional knowledge about medicinal plants. Now, our ability to both learn from others and transmit that knowledge was a major transition in human history. And undoubtedly, it helped us refine our survival strategies, especially as we were exposed to very diverse ecological settings. All this knowledge that can collectively be called traditional knowledge is unique to each culture, but obviously some aspects are shared among different cultures. And the subject of this talk is basically the macroevolutionary process underlying the transmission of traditional knowledge among cultures. And when we talk about cultural transmission, broadly there's two types. There's vertical transmission or phylogenetic transmission, which is from a parent to a daughter culture. And at the macro scale, that leads to a pattern where closely related cultures are similar with respect to a certain cultural trait under study. On the other hand, in the case of horizontal transmission, we've got neighboring cultures sharing information, so there's diffusion of cultural traits. And again, at the macro scale, we see the pattern that we observe is cultures that are found closely to each other in space, being similar with regard to a certain cultural trait. And there's evidence for both, so both take place and sometimes even at the same time. However, what's neglected in this process, not always but very frequently, is the role of the environment in this. And if not all, many cultural traits are adapted to certain environments or definitely constrained or influenced in other ways by the environment. And given the diversity of the environments that humans are exposed to, I think environment should be more integrated. So in order to study modes of transmission and the role of the environment, we need a suitable cultural trait. And for this study, we use traditional herbal medicine. It's a very important cultural trait. Almost every culture has it, and there's body of knowledge about traditional medicine everywhere. And there's been different hypotheses and against support for both in different studies from different fields. So one says that people are very conservative in how they transmit and how they inherit knowledge, because it's a very important trait that has to do with healthcare. People will only adopt the knowledge of the parent culture. So that would lead to a vertical transmission. On the other hand, through migration, people have been exposed to very different floristic environments. So people are exposed to different plants, so they can't use often the plants of the parent culture. And they often come into contact with new cultures, and there's more cultural mix and exchange. And so I've narrowed it down to three scenarios that are not mutually exclusive. So in the far left, you see the vertical transmission. So you see a hypothetical phylogeny of 6 hypothetical cultures. And the mortar and pestles represent medicinal systems, and we end up with closely related cultures having similar medicinal systems. So that's the similar colors. And then we have the spatial distributions of those cultures. And within that space, there's 2 different environments. And if environment is very important in the transmission of the knowledge of a certain trait, and in this case medicinal plants, then we'll see groups of medicinal systems that represent those differences in the environment. So you have the two different colors representing the environment. Whereas if horizontal exchange, so neighboring cultures exchanging information is important, then we have basically a mix of information between neighboring cultures. And in order to study those processes, we investigated 12 ethnic groups from Nepal. And the reason why we chose Nepal is because it's got an outstanding cultural diversity. There's more than 75 ethnic groups in the country, and the 12 ethnic groups we chose represent more or less 40 to 50% of the population in the country. There's also great floristic diversity and a lot of medicinal plants. Herbal medicine is very important in the country. And for those ethnic groups, for pairs of those ethnic groups, we calculated 4 distances. So the first was linguistic distance based on classification of the languages they speak. And we use that as a proxy for cultural relatedness. And we measure distance by measuring nodes on the tree. So these cultures have a distance of 1, because there's only one node between them, whereas these two have a distance of 1, 2, 3, 4, because that's the number of nodes connecting them. Then we collected information of the plants that those ethnic groups use, and to code the environment in this, we recorded the local flora of each group, so the plants that people are exposed to. And to calculate the distances between the local floras and medicinal floras between different ethnic groups, we used the phylogenetic approach. So we used a big tree of the flora of Nepal, showing the relationships of plants. And the reason we did that is because a few studies have shown that there's phylogenetic patterns in the selection of plants. So people select specific lineages and not just everything that's around them. And that has implication in how we study cross-cultural ethnobotany. So again, I really like those mortars and pestles, and I've thrown them all over the presentation. So we've got 3 cultures, blue, green, and orange. And these are the species they use in traditional medicine. Now, if we want to calculate similarities between the floras, you'll see that these cultures use only one species in common. So, using traditional methods, the similarity of the medicinal floras between the 3 groups are virtually the same in all pairwise comparisons. Whereas if you take phylogeny into consideration, you see that orange and green have selected very closely related species, which could be due to different availabilities in the local environments. So essentially we included phylogeny to account for differences in the local floras. And I won't go into detail about how we calculated the distances, but yeah, the distances you see are basically phylogenetic distances on the tree of the flora of Nepal. And the final distance between cultures is geographic distance. So we took the midpoint locality of the distribution of the language in the country and calculated the distance for all pairs of cultures. So we ended up with matrices that show pairwise distances, and we estimated correlation with using mantle tests. And for those of you that don't know how a mantle test works, basically it permutes the rows and columns in one of the matrices, and it gives you an estimate of the significance of the correlation between the matrices. So it's a randomization test essentially, and tells you if the correlation between 2 matrices is more than expected or less than expected. So firstly, we found no correlation between cultural relatedness and similarities in floras. So there was no support for vertical transmission of medicine, of traditional medicine. So if two cultures are closely related, they don't necessarily have similar medicinal floras. However, we found a very strong and significant correlation with the environment. So if cultures are found in similar floristic environments, they'll end up using very similar plants. Of course, there could be an effect of geography and distance and horizontal transmission, because you can imagine that cultures that are found in similar environments are also found next to each other. But when we calculated the correlation between distance between cultures and the similarity in their ethnofloras, there was a somewhat strong correlation, but not a significant one. So if you found next to each other, you don't necessarily use the same plants. One problem with this could be that closely related cultures are found in similar environments. So the correlation that we found between the environment and the similarities in ethnofloras could partly be due to underlying cultural relatedness. However, we found that closely related cultures are not found in similar environments, and they're not found in close proximity to each other. Okay. So what we would expect that, as it's an important cultural trait, and important in this case means that it's used for healthcare, we would expect that people would employ a conservative approach in transmitting and adapting the trait. However, I think the reason we find this strong link with the environment is because traditional medicine contributes to fitness of human populations in certain environments. And of course, people have to readapt medicinal floras as they migrate to different environments based on the resources that are available there. And just to conclude, we found no evidence for vertical transmission of traditional medicine. I believe there must be some, but we just couldn't detect it in this case. However, we found a direct link to the natural environment, the flora. And I think with migrations of different cultures, the macroevolution of traditional knowledge has been experimental and flexible, and people have converged to using the same plants in similar environments. And where this whole thing is going, this was all an experiment. And if you have any comments, I'd really like to hear about them. But where we're going with this is we like to see, to calculate rates of change of different parts of traditional knowledge, and do similar analysis in different scales of geographic proximity, ecological distance, and cultural distance. And we want to see how different parts of traditional knowledge might co-evolve with each other, and definitely integrate migration routes that might give us more detailed information in how people interact with the environment as they migrate. So thank you very much, and if you have questions and criticism, they're both very welcome.